Welcome, my name is Linda Kellum and I'm the incoming chair of GODORT, the Government Documents Roundtable. GODORT was founded in 1972 as a forum for discussions of government publications. It has expanded to focus to include government information in all forms. And we're always looking for new members and committee volunteers, so if you're interested, please feel free to email me. You can also get in touch with us at our website. We are very pleased that this panel was chosen by ALA to be a jury program for ALA Annual, and we're thrilled that we still have the opportunity to bring our panelists together, even if it's virtual. I'm going to now hand over to Deborah Caldwell, the chair of our program.
All right. Thank you for joining us. The right to vote has it's a hard one, right, for many in this country, but yet it's still true that the reality is that the fight for suffrage continues for many people, including struggles over residency requirements, ID laws, and felon re-enfranchisement. Moreover, efforts to restrict voting rights disproportionately impact communities of color, incarcerated people, and students. With the upcoming 2020 presidential election, the question of disenfranchisement will become prominent again. Disenfranchisement can take many forms, from the formal removal of a person's right to vote to an individual's decision to withdraw from taking part in the electoral process. Libraries have close interaction with the public and therefore have a civic duty to provide information access to their patrons. When providing access to information such as accurate and timely details over voter ID requirements becomes politically charged, libraries can become targets for those who oppose easy access to ballots. This panel discussion will provide insight into some of the major issues related to disenfranchisement. Speakers will be discussing larger issues of voting rights and legislation around the world, the state of disenfranchisement in the US, particularly when it comes to felons and incarcerated individuals, and what libraries can do to promote voting education in their communities, with particular emphasis on incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. So today we have with us our panelists. First will be Kathryn Elena. She is the Senior Global Legal Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. She is responsible for providing strategic leadership and technical assistance to IFES work on legal and regulatory frameworks for elections, electoral dispute resolution, and electoral integrity. Kathryn has written on electoral integrity within a US context specifically, and will provide a comparative perspective to the panel. After that, we've got Nicole Porter. She is the Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. She manages the Sentencing Project's state and local advocacy efforts on sentencing reform, voting rights, and eliminating racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And then last, we've got Leslie Purdy. Leslie is a librarian at the Folsom State Prison and Folsom Women's Facility in Reprise, California. Before paying her debt to society, Ms. Purdy worked in the public libraries, where she developed an interest in working with underserved populations. She participated in the ALA Emerging Leaders class of 2019 and is a student at the San Jose State University High School, where she will where she completed her degree, right, in fall of 2019.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Sorry, I'm reading the bio from our proposal when we submitted it last year. Currently Leslie is working to implement a voter education program for incarcerated individuals. And for moderators, I'm Deborah Caldwell. I'm a University resident librarian at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and Linda is the Senior Data Librarian at Cornell Institute for Social and Economic Research, and we're doing this with sponsorship from GODORT, and as part of our work on GODORT's various committees. So first up, we've got Kathryn.
Well, perfect. Thank you, Linda and Deborah, for the introduction, and particularly for the invitation to take part in this panel. It's fascinating for me to be able to learn about the role of libraries and librarians in civic duty and in enfranchisement in particular. I'm really happy to be able to start the conversation off with a comparative perspective around the world of some of the challenges around enfranchisement, focusing particularly on the difference between enfranchisement in the law and enfranchisement in practice, and the need to be able to have both. So next slide. So just in terms of international standards, there are obviously some very clear standards in international conventions that govern enfranchisement. You can see here, obviously, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is very clear that everyone should have the right and the opportunity to vote in elections by way of universal and equal suffrage. And this is repeated essentially in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, where again it talks about both the right and the opportunity. And that gets at both the legal right that's protected under the law, but the opportunity to exercise that right without barriers. And then why is this in these international conventions? Because that's how we guarantee the free expression of the will of the voters. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to, that the will of the voters determined how we are governed and by who. ICCPR has additional commentary from the Human Rights Commission, you can see here, that talks about the fact that the exercise of these fundamental rights should not be suspended or excluded, except on the grounds that are objective and reasonable. And I think we'll talk a little bit about both of these elements in terms of suspending rights, for example, when someone might be in prison, or excluding them for certain grounds which may be discriminatory. So next slide. There are common limitations in most countries on who can vote. So it's not as though everyone across the earth has the automatic right to be able to vote in each country. Obviously, the common limitations are around citizenship. So are you a citizen of that particular country? Age, and obviously 18 is a very common age of enfranchisement, when people have reached that age where the country believes that they will be a valuable contribution to deciding governance. And residence is another common one. So have you been resident in your country for a certain number of years or a certain time to be able to have the right to decide who is governing that country? But there are also in some countries some restrictions even on these very common limitations. So for example, in some countries, if you are a dual citizen, you may not be able to vote in a particular country, even though you have citizenship of the country you're living in. So that sort of gets at the point of, are they reasonable? They also need to be actionable in practice. I was working recently on an independence referendum in the autonomous region of Bougainville, which is in a tiny island of Papua New Guinea in my backyard. I'm from New Zealand. They were holding an independence referendum to determine their succession from Papua New Guinea. So it was a fundamental election and referendum. But the question came about that because the referendum kept being delayed, more and more young people were turning 18 but might not be enfranchised in time to be able to cast their vote on such a fundamental referendum. So the idea of the right being actionable in practice is really important. And then there can be barriers to exercising the right. So for example, we're working right now on forthcoming elections in Ethiopia, which has quite a sizable proportion of pastoralists who move around the country based on the seasons. And again, this raises issues around residency requirements and ID requirements that can cause a barrier. So other specific restrictions we do see in some countries, and the other panelists are going to talk about this, and most commonly this is around prisoners convicted or serving a sentence. But another very common one is persons with certain mental incapacity, and it's phrased differently depending on the legal framework of the country in question. Occasionally, we also see restrictions on active military and police being able to vote, but this is not as common as the other two restrictions. I won't go into this, but we certainly see more restrictions when it comes to actual candidacy rather than voting. So for example, around bankruptcies, criminal records, dual citizenship, education requirements, and even in some countries, requirements for certificate of integrity that you are a good person, which of course raises a lot of concerns about objectivity. And I think voter registration can serve as either a bridge or a barrier to upholding the principle of universal suffrage. So it's, again, so important that the right is enshrined in the law, but the actual practice of enfranchisement gets rid of those barriers to exercise the rights. So you can see here on the slide commonly disenfranchised populations, whether it is in the law or whether it is in practice. That first one there, it's quite common, as I said before, to have a limitation on the right to vote for citizens who have intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. Now, this is despite the fact that these political rights exist for persons with disabilities under the CRPD. One of the arguments against this is that certain people who might have psychosocial disabilities would be vulnerable to fraud, and certain people could manipulate their vote. However, to date, there's been no true evidence and no real study if that's actually the case. So from IFAS's perspective, we see this as such a fundamental right that any restrictions on this would need to be very, very carefully prescribed, for example, a court order around a certain type of incapacity. Indigenous persons obviously are a significant number around the world. In most countries where you have Indigenous populations, there are some challenges around enfranchisement. Often this relates to particularly around residency. So for example, Indigenous communities in the United States may not have a street address where they can be sent registration requirements. They may also have literacy issues. So even if they have the technical right to vote, there may be barriers being put in place for them to actually be able to exercise it. Internally displaced persons is becoming more and more of an issue, of course, estimated to be 40 million worldwide. And again, while they may have the right to vote in terms of citizenship and age, there may be barriers in place, for example, around residency, where they happen to be residing. Can they vote in the constituency in which they are from, or do they need to vote in the temporary place that they are? And do they have the documentation they need to prove their eligibility? Those can be significant barriers that IFAS works very hard in certain countries to overcome. I'll touch only briefly about disenfranchisement due to a criminal conviction, because I know the panelists here know much more about this than I do, but it's very common challenge around the world, and different countries take different approaches. I think there are a lot of countries where there are no limitations whatsoever on prisoners voting. In other countries, there are, I would say, 3 different approaches. Some kind of selective restriction, where certain types of felons are banned from voting while they're in prison. Some have a complete ban on voting for any type of prisoner. And some even have post-release restrictions. So felons might be banned from voting even after release, perhaps for a certain number of years. So next, and then the last one, for women, we don't often see in legal frameworks restrictions on women voting anymore, but we see many types of barriers for women being able to access their vote freely. And this quote actually came from focus groups we did in Bangladesh, where they said women rarely get the opportunity to be able to vote from their will, that it's often like a family or a tribal community group that is directing how they vote. And we're finding actually in the current COVID-19 environment that this is becoming even more challenging with women at home with their partners who are potentially influencing their ability to vote freely. So again, just to emphasize that distinction between disenfranchisement in law and in practice. And again, these are the international principles that govern the fact that they must be enfranchised in practice. So you can see 2 important quotes here, I think. I'll do the second one first, that states under international law are actually under an obligation to put in place effective measures, so measures that work, to ensure that those people who are eligible can actually exercise it. And the US is a country that's a signatory to the ICCPR. The other one is that disenfranchise is not just restricting the rights of individuals in the law, but it can also be around other factors that reduce the value of your vote. And that gets at the fact of the equality of the vote regarding another vote. And I'll explain this if we go to the next slide. Well, it'll be the one after this, but just touching on this first. Okay, I can turn on this. So IFAS did a study between international election experts and domestic election experts. And we asked questions around certain issues in the US, such as voter ID laws and what is required to prove eligibility, issues around gerrymandering and the fact that there are partisan organizations that potentially draw maps, and other issues such as the fact that elections in some states are run by elected officials themselves. And you can see the difference there. And when it says before and after, this was how the participants felt before they were asked the questions, and then how they felt at the end of the survey if things had changed. But you can see quite a difference in international experts who consider these fundamental principles on a daily basis compared to how many US experts felt about the US electoral system. And a lot of what fed into this was around issues such as voter ID laws and gerrymandering that potentially reduce the value of an individual's vote, which many would say is a serious form of disenfranchisement. So apologies if you go back one slide. So you'll see here, this is a quote from OSCE ODIHR. They observed the 2016 United States elections. Interestingly, in the US, many states actually don't allow international observation, which we would say is an absolute international principle that is observed by many countries we work with around the world. But you can see here specifically their assessment was that certain legal changes were motivated by partisan interests, and that there were these undue obstacles for voters actually exercising their rights. So ultimately, the assessment of this international institution is that suffrage rights are not guaranteed, and it leaves certain sections of the population without the ability to cast their vote. And I know the other panelists are going to touch on this. So just to sort of, I think, wrap things up, when it comes to the right and the opportunity to vote, the international standards do provide that the legal framework should be very cautious that any restrictions are minimal and proportional on the right to vote. And we are seeing the trend globally is towards broadening the franchise. So coming back to some of those categories of voters I mentioned before, there is a trend to require a court order to determine that someone has an intellectual or psychosocial disability that really impacts their ability to make an informed choice. Many countries are moving to allow active duty military police to be able to vote in barracks. And many are limiting the restrictions on voting rights of those convicted of crimes, and particularly trying to make sure that if there are any restrictions, that they are proportional to the punishment or nature of the crime. So this is a snapshot of some of the international standards and the international variations and how different countries are approaching the issue of enfranchisement. And I look forward to talking more about the US situation in particular.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Porter with the Sentencing Project, where I'm the Director of Advocacy. I manage the state advocacy portfolio, which includes a range of priorities from sentencing reform to felony enfranchisement. The Sentencing Project is a bridge organization between the academy and the activists. And I work specifically with state campaigns who, on a range of issues, including expanding the franchise to people with felony convictions. So as of 2016, 6.1 million Americans were prohibited from voting due to laws that disenfranchise citizens convicted of a felony offense. Felony disenfranchisement rates vary by state to state, and as states institute a wide range of disenfranchisement policies. The general narratives assumes that justice-involved residents cannot vote. This is baked into the culture, and I've seen misconceptions shared in movies and television shows, and bandied about on Saturday morning talk shows by pundits who don't realize the policy nuances that vary from state to state. The history of felony disenfranchisement in the United States goes back to the founding of the country. English colonialists brought the practice to North America through the common law practice of a civil death and set out criminal penalties specifically as an underlying cause revocating a resident's voting rights. Early colonial laws limited the penalty of disenfranchisement to certain offenses related to voting or considered egregious violations of one's moral code. After the American Revolution, states began codifying disenfranchisement provisions and expanding the penalty to all felony offenses, and many states instituted felony disenfranchising policies in the wake of the Civil War, and by 1869, 29 states had enacted such laws. During the post-Reconstruction era following the Civil War, several Southern states tailored their disenfranchising laws in order to bar Black residents, Black male voters in particular, from participating in the franchise, specifically targeting offenses they believe to be committed most frequently by the Black population. For example, party leaders in Mississippi called for disenfranchisement of offenses like burglary, theft, and arson, but not for robbery or murder. And the author of Alabama's disenfranchising provision estimated that the crime of wife beating alone would disqualify 60% of Black residents from participating in the franchise at the time. The resulting policy would disenfranchise a man for beating his wife, but not for killing her. Today, there continues to be disproportionate impact of felony disenfranchisement on the Black electorate throughout the United States. This aligns with the cumulative impact of racial disparities in other aspects of the criminal justice system. Since the 1980s, residents have had a higher chance of coming in contact with law enforcement. And once they come in contact with law enforcement, they have a higher chance of going to prison. And given that they're going to prison, they have a higher chance of getting a felony conviction, resulting in disenfranchising policies, at least while they're incarcerated in most states, all but two. And in many states, there are post-sentence disenfranchising policies, which I'll go into. The 11 most extreme states restrict voting rights for some or all individuals even after they've served their prison sentence and are no longer on probation or parole or otherwise serving a community supervision term outside of a lockup facility. And individuals who reside in those states make up 50% of the entire disenfranchised population. There's only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that allow people to vote while they're in prison custody. Persons currently in prison or jail represent a minority of the total disenfranchised population throughout the US. In fact, 77% of disenfranchised voters live in their communities, either under probation or parole, or after completing their sentence. In that same category, the number of persons who've gotten their votes back are also living in the community. Since 1997, 23 states have amended felony disenfranchising policies in an effort to reduce their restrictiveness and expand voting rights. The total number of people who are disenfranchised in the community numbers close to 6 million. Since 1997, 23 states have amended these policies. 7 states either repealed or amended lifetime disenfranchisement laws. 6 states expanded voting rights to some or all under community supervision. And 17 states eased the restoration process for persons seeking to have their right to vote restored after completing their sentence. All in all, these reforms have been animated by campaigns that have often been led by formerly incarcerated activists to reform the restrictive voting laws. And these efforts have helped to politicize a new generation of activists, many of whom have lived experience inside of prison and jails, and others who are called to expand voting rights to people in the community who are at the margins because of their justice involvement or other exclusions from the franchise. As a result of these reforms, achieved during the period of 1997 to 2018, millions of persons regained their right to vote. Through dedicated campaigns, 1.4 million got their voting rights back in that same period, in that time period. And that doesn't even include the 1.4 million in Florida who got their voting rights back when the Amendment 4 ballot measure was adopted by a majority of Florida residents in fall of 2018. It also doesn't include the tens of thousands in New Jersey, Colorado, and Nevada who got their voting rights back last year, and I'll go into a little bit of description over that as well. These advocacy wins were attained with civic groups in many states, including those led by formerly incarcerated leaders like All of Us Are United in California, as well as the state chapters of the League of Women Voters and the NAACP. And these civic organizations might be great partners to host discussions in person or virtually on voting rights in particular jurisdictions, and might also provide technical assistance through organized discussions, whether virtually or in person as well. I just wanted to share specifically what changes took place over the last couple of years. I've already touched on this. These are all reforms that were adopted last year. In Colorado, lawmakers passed legislation that expanded voting rights to people living in the community on parole. That's over 11,000 residents in that state. So Coloradans may not know that their voting rights were expanded in 2019. So ensuring that they have the right information will be critical going into the November election. Similarly, in Nevada, voting rights were expanded to people living in the community under supervision on probation or parole. 77,000 Nevadans got their voting rights back when that law was enacted in 2019. Again, similar levels of confusion may persist, and so access to information will be critical, and libraries can be great partners in that. New Jersey as well, 83,000 persons got their voting rights back last year who were living in the community on felony probation or parole. And information shared in New Jersey's libraries, online events, or in-person events to get the word out to New Jerseyans about that will be critical going into November. So to the extent that there's capacity, it would be wonderful to organize public discussions over the next few months to ensure that the general public is aware of the policy differences from state to state, particularly in states where there have been recent law changes. There's a lot of work that's gone into doing public education by many civic organization partners like the League of Women Voters and the NAACP or the state affiliate of the ACLU. But certainly partnering with libraries will be critical in making sure that this information is made publicly available through education opportunities. And so between now and the next couple of months, there's a great deal of opportunity around that. You know, I hope that there's an opportunity to organize online discussions through virtual library spaces or in-person library spaces, and civic groups can help to partner by hosting seminars, providing information and materials within libraries for the general public, and might also partner with some of their time to provide technical assistance to residents in learning about the law, having one-on-one discussions about recent law changes, and also registering to vote and clarifying any misconceptions about the voter disenfranchising policies in their jurisdiction. So I'll wrap up my comments there and look forward to the next presenter and also discussing further questions in the Q&A.
Hi, I'm Leslie Purdy. I'm a librarian at Folsom State Prison. Thank you so much for having me. I feel really honored to be able to do this with Kathryn and Nicole. But I'm here because last fall I created a voting rights presentation, and I'm currently teleworking, but when I'm actually at the facility, I visit classrooms and speak to prison inmates about their voting rights upon release. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about Folsom and the population I serve. So Folsom State Prison opened in 1880. In 1968, Johnny Cash played a concert here. That's kind of our big claim to fame. If you heard of us, that's probably why. We're located about 20 miles east of Sacramento in Northern California. And Folsom State Prison currently houses 2,694 men. And the Folsom Women's Facility, which is on the same property and supervised by the same warden, houses 276 women, and I work at both prisons. We serve a racially diverse population, which is common in prison. Currently, 37% of the population is African American, 35% identify as Latino, 18% are white, and 10% identify as other, which is an ambiguous category that includes inmates who are Asian American, Native American, or who just don't identify with any of the other categories. And then many people are understandably curious about what prison librarians do all day. It's kind of a weird job. We primarily facilitate access to the courts through the prison law library. Inmates will come into the library to research case law, and librarians provide users with whatever additional legal resources they need to complete their research. But we also function as a public library and a school library for the prison population. We provide recreational reading materials and facilitate rehabilitative programs. Like I run a book club, we've done trivia nights and coloring clubs, and then I decided to do this voting rights presentation. And since we're under the umbrella of education, we also partner with teachers to provide supplemental materials for basic education and college classes. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I decided to do this and why I felt it was important. Voter education in prison is important for numerous reasons, but I was motivated by the fact that so many of the inmates I knew, even people who are far more knowledgeable about the law than I am, didn't understand their rights. I never want to project a need onto this population. I try to be really cognizant of the fact that I'm an outsider. And whenever I'm thinking about implementing a new program, I like to consult our inmate clerks and ask their opinion. We have a really diverse group of workers who I know will always give me their brutally honest opinion. And none of them most of them had assumed that that their voting rights would never be restored. I think there were one or two people who did know that, but they approved of this idea, and so I decided to push forward with it. Another reason I felt it was important is that we need to think of ways as librarians and really as a society to reduce recidivism and help facilitate reintegration. So voting is a pro-social activity. And I actually linked an article, Federal Probation, I used this in grad school, that is about the importance of civic engagement in reducing recidivism. And they kind of provide this model that talks about how democratic participation and community involvement could potentially reduce recidivism. Along the same lines, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 95% of all state prison inmates will be released from prison at some point, and 80% will be released for parole supervision. And similarly in CDCR, we have a saying that today's inmate is tomorrow's neighbor, which is this kind of like trite saying that people throw around. But I actually think it's pretty meaningful, and I think it really means that just as a society, we need to think about what's going to happen to this population when they leave prison. And then just briefly about, in California, our voting laws in terms of felony disenfranchisement, persons with a criminal history, including people who have felony convictions, regain their voting rights once they're off parole. So people who are incarcerated in state prison can't vote. As Nicole said, there are only 2 states where people who are in custody can actually vote. But most people who are incarcerated in county jails in California can still vote unless they're serving a state prison sentence in county jail. They're in jail for a parole violation, or they're awaiting transfer to a state or federal prison for a felony conviction. And then that brings me to the next slide, which is about this actual presentation that I did and the contents of it. So the presentation was like 15 to 20 minutes long. I had a visual aid. I made posters on Canva that had, cutesy clip art. And that was including time for questions. So for the first portion, I gave them this abridged version of the history of voting rights and voter suppression in the United States. I talked about poll taxes and literacy tests and how they affected African American and indigent populations. And then in the second portion, I focused on the voting rights for persons with a criminal history in California. I just explained the laws and their rights. And finally, I talked about the importance of civic engagement, and I discussed reasons why they should consider voting, and tried to personalize the conversation by providing examples that applied to their lives. I basically just tried to impress upon them that their opinions matter, and that they have a unique and valuable perspective, and that there are opportunities in their communities for them to make a difference, and that there are people outside the walls who want to hear what they have to say. I find that's really important to be able to relate to this population. I mean, I think it's really true of anyone, But I've certainly, when I've even done, more casual programs like book clubs, I try to find material that thematically will relate to their lives and that it's a more meaningful experience for them. And in doing this, I also included a packet of print resources. I included a printout of the California Secretary of State webpage on voting rights for persons with a criminal history and information on voter suppression. I know it will probably horrify some of the librarians in the audience that I wasted so much paper, but I really wanted them to have a physical copy of some of the information, and inmates don't have access to the internet. So I couldn't just give them a link, and I didn't have any way to do like a PowerPoint. As a librarian, I'm always interested in the response to programs, like when I talk to people, and with this, the response to these presentations was overwhelmingly positive. I was shocked that they were so well received. I've never done a program in prison that generated so much interest. Many people asked thoughtful questions. They were really interested in the material. It generated a lot of discussion. I had people come to my office afterward and want more information. I was really just blown away by it. And the vast majority of people I talked to were unaware that their voting rights would be restored after they were off parole. So it did feel like a meaningful exercise to do this. And it was not that labor intensive in terms of, as a librarian, in terms of costs and resources. So I definitely felt like it was worth doing and to keep doing it. So the last portion is just about how I think libraries can help. There are a few concrete, easy steps that we can take to provide services for this population. Nicole mentioned this too, but I think that, my first suggestion is to partner with local organizations. My experience has been that many organizations do want to help this population, but they face barriers in terms of access, in terms of getting behind the walls. I reached out to county elections at one point, and they were actually really enthusiastic about doing voter education programs, but it's really difficult where I work to get volunteers into the facility. If you work in prison, that might not necessarily be the case. It really depends on your warden, so your mileage may vary, and it might be something that you want to pursue. But I also think it would be great if public libraries partnered with local organizations to provide voter education programs on site and virtually, and to partner to do outreach to this population. Another suggestion I have is to provide digital and print resources on felony disenfranchisement. This is something that we can do in prison and also in public libraries. I think in prison, it's pretty easy to just provide, print resources on your state laws and felony disenfranchisement and just make them available to your population. In public libraries, our local public library has general information on voting at the library on their website, like where to drop off a ballot. But I think there's room for improvement here. It's an opportunity to provide information to an underserved population, and I think it would be great to see more materials in English and Spanish, at least, maybe in other languages, depending on your local population, on state laws and felony disenfranchisement. Just a footnote, I insist on print resources because many people, particularly people who have been incarcerated for many years, I work with a large aging population who are released from prison are on the wrong side of the digital divide. They have limited technology skills. We need to be sensitive to that and not assume that everyone knows how to use a computer. And I know it seems archaic, but print materials for this population do improve access to the information. And my final suggestion is that if your budget allows, to provide resources that cater to different Lexile levels, or at least be sensitive to the Lexile level that you're printing in. Because from my experience, I can tell you that many inmates read at a lower literacy level and would benefit from resources that cater to those needs. And it's just another way to make these resources more inclusive. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
All right. Thank you guys so much. But if anyone has any questions or questions for each other.
I have a question. One of them was any advice all three of you might have for, because one of the things that librarians are going to be cognizant of is pushback on these kinds of programs because of the politicization of voting rights in this day and age. And so I was just wondering if you have any kind of words of advice for people who are trying to implement programs like these.
Yeah, we have this challenge in a lot of places where we work, and working on elections is just sensitive anyway because of partisan interests. I think Leslie made a good comment about partnerships with different organizations and certainly county election officers, and trying to work with, I mean, I think librarians are actually in a good position as being seen as fairly non-partisan. And then if you're partnering potentially with an election office, being seen to then just be providing kind of factual education information, I think is a good way to go about it. As soon as it moves beyond that kind of basic voter education piece, I think we find in countries where we work for it to be very sensitive, but it's certainly a case of building relationships and partnering with the right organizations to be able to then get into your audience.
And I'll just add that obviously these partnerships shouldn't be with political parties, but they could be with nonpartisan civic organizations, some of which I mentioned. And I think the county elections board that Leslie suggested is a great suggestion for that, but also nonprofit civic groups like the League of Women Voters and the NAACP. I mean, they are explicitly nonpartisan. So to the extent that any librarians are concerned about politicizing voting in the United States, working with nonpartisan organizations intentionally can help address that.
Well, one of the questions we did talk about before was the question about how can, especially, and this is relevant to you, Leslie, and talking about print, how can we work within a COVID culture, ideas we might be able to do. I think Nicole mentioned webinars at one point, but.
Yeah, well, I'll just jump in. I mean, I think that we're in new territory over the next couple of months, and people are using a great deal of online tools to continue education events. So to the extent that public libraries have Facebook pages and can do Facebook Live events, or use other online platforms to, record information and post it later for viewing, that could be another way to partner with local civic groups, including the county election board, but also civic groups like the League of Women Voters and others. So, this is an opportunity to try out new things and new ways of engaging the public. And given what I think we've all shared around the lack of information that many people have and the misconceptions that people have about their voting rights, I would say to the extent that there's capacity, there shouldn't be a lack of reason, certainly, to have, different sort of opportunities to share out this information, because it's definitely needed.
I have a comment too, just on the COVID-19 environment, and I'm not sure if it's relevant to the US, but in some countries we're seeing early releases from prison because of the threat or the worry about the spread of coronavirus within prisons. And I find this to be an intriguing and interesting issue, particularly if these prisoners are being released early and potentially getting their voting rights back earlier than they expected. Then you've got a whole new population to potentially be targeted and enfranchised. Like I said, I'm not sure if it's happening here, but it's something that we're grappling with in a number of countries.
There are modest releases in the United States, not to the extent that there need to be to decarcerate and, protect people against COVID-19. But that's a good point, because that is a new population of people that might be unclear about what their voting rights are going into November.
Mm-hmm. And as Leslie was talking too, I was thinking about programs for family members might be an interesting way to do this, especially because if we can't have access to a particular population, that targeting people who have.
Scott, I have a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
What's the best way to be a strong ally for both changes to disenfranchisement and for education for incarcerated people? So, thinking of things that we could do individually.
I think the next area of reform is around expanding voting rights to people in the community. So I touched on that in my comments, but there are entire states like California, as a matter of fact, where people are excluded from voting if they're on parole. There needs to be new campaigns around that going into, the next legislative session in many states. And, I'm just so inspired by the work that Leslie's doing at Folsom. And so, to the extent that other prison, librarians who are working in prison libraries can have additional civic information and do civic education, that would be really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on time, so I just wanted to give a little shout out for, we're planning to do a follow-up in August. I think August is typically when ALA releases the recordings from the conference. I don't know if that timing is going to change because of everything going virtual this time. So what we're planning to do is have a follow-up presentation when that recording is made available, and when we can then disseminate it to like non-ALA participants, and then like as many of y'all as are able to join us again in August, hopefully all 3 of you, and then possibly with some additional public librarians who might have some specific strategies. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you again so much, Kathryn, Nicole, and Leslie. Thanks, Linda, and my uncredited helper here, Kenya, who has also been a big part of the planning for this, and our test audience member, Scott, for helping us out with this recording. And thanks again to Godort, of course, for sponsoring this program. It has been a delight and a pleasure to put it together and to get to work with all of you on this, and I'm looking forward to doing more in the future.